Good morning, everyone. This is Victor Lund with the WAV Group, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, I'm going to introduce my guest, Rick Haase. He's the founding partner of Envision Advisors. He's an expert at running enterprise brokerages. He's had a lot of experience, and those of you who have been associated with the Realty Alliance certainly know Rick and what he brings to the table. Today's webinar is going to be talking about the real estate brokerage model, how it's changing and what it means for your business. So this is really intended for real estate brokers to kind of understand the developments that are happening in the way that real estate brokerage models work, and allow you to have some ideas around how you can pivot to empower your brokers to be successful. Before we get started, I do want to let you know that the GoToWebinar control panel has a questions dialog box. And if you expand that box, you can put in your question, and when we get to the end of today's webinar, those questions will be answered. Everyone will be on mute during today's webinar, so if you're talking, we won't hear you. But we will be able to get to you at the end, and we'll make sure that all your questions are answered. So to get started, I just want to give a little background on me, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a founding partner of the WAV Group. I also am the CEO of RE Technology. We work with Project Upstream, we work with the Broker Public Portal, we work with the Real Estate Standards Organization. We've been providing consulting services in the real estate industry for a couple decades. Joining me on today's call is Rick Haase. I'll just give you a little background on Rick. There we go. So Rick's been active in real estate brokerage leadership for, like I said, many decades. He was recently the CEO of Ladder and Blum, and they're an interesting company because they operate in multiple states, and they're one of the largest, the most successful brokerages in the country. I think either the largest or close to being the largest ERA franchise in the country. They also operated a 100% transaction fee brokerage. So he brings quite a wealth of experience, and he's operated a lot of successful companies before that, and has a tremendous depth of experience running complete home services companies. That means not only residential real estate, but commercial real estate, mortgage banks, title companies, insurance companies, all of the settlement services. So Rick, welcome to today's webinar. Thanks for taking some time to sit with us today, and I really appreciate you sharing some of your insights.
Glad to be here, and thanks for the invite, Victor. You know, as Victor said in the intro, over the last 8 years, we've looked at nearly 50 companies, and in the course of looking at those companies for the purpose of mergers and acquisitions, we were able to get 18 of those across the acquisition finish line. That brought us from the 64th largest company in the nation to the 24th largest brokerage in the country, a nearly 350% growth rate and agent count. Victor, one of the things you said in my in the introduction is that I was the CEO. Just a quick adjustment. I was president. It was right on the screen. I was president of Ladder and Blum Inc. and Ladder and Blum a good bit of the last 7.5 years. So getting 18 across the finish line, it was an interesting process, but one of the most interesting parts of it is that right around the 15th or 16th company that we were able to acquire, we did what one prominent broker told me. He referred to it as we crossed over to the dark side. We actually purchased and integrated a transaction fee brokerage. It's not an easy thing to do, to decide to bring in a transaction fee brokerage in, especially in a at that time, near 100-year-old, very traditional company. So I'm pleased to be here today, and I'm sure pleased to be sharing some of the processes and some of the important lessons learned. One of those things is I get asked to speak a lot about real estate and related topics, and one of the things that we have to get clear on as we begin is what it is that we're really talking about. It's hard to stay focused, so I want to make sure we're on the same language. So one of the things we're here to talk about is the transaction fee brokerage, and it is an issue that's internal to the industry. It's about agent compensation and what gets delivered for that agent compensation. So what we deliver. What is not going to be talked about is the consumer model changes. So a lot of times you hear people speaking from the front of a room or on a webinar, they're going to be talking about model changes, and everybody has a slightly different idea of what that means. But for us, and so that we can go farther faster in today's webinar, I want to make sure that what we're talking about is the transaction fee agent compensation model and what gets delivered for that, not consumer model, although it's a very natural progression. And there are some things on the horizon that I'm going to talk about here in the next few minutes that would naturally lead us into that. But today it's not about that. So one of the most important things that Envision Advisors and I can do for our clients is that we help them see clearly. It's actually in our mission to help our clients see clearly, move boldly, and innovate. Many in our industry, I say, have been anesthetized by decades-long. We've all heard the story of the boy who cried wolf. Well, it's time to break through that anesthesia of the past 3 decades. There's been so many false alarms throughout my time in the business. This innovation or this technology will disrupt our business. It'll put us all out of business. And then there's the usual resistance to that. And unfortunately, I think some people have figured out how to make money through the boy who cried wolf false alarms. And having said that, now we're at a place where we can call it the wolf is really at the door. And so I want to kind of walk people through that. And as I do that, I want to remind everybody that it's all too easy to downplay, disregard, and dismiss the relatively new and disruptive agent compensation models that have been greatly altering the profitability and the viability of companies. When we talked to 50 companies and got 18 to the finish line, it's remarkable how many of those companies have had complete value destruction based on trying to compete with those transaction fee type companies. So walk with me now as I kind of light up the continuum of the evolution of our history and why this is no longer a moment where the boy is crying wolf. The wolf is actually at the door. So here we go. We devised this in the form of an equation. And, you know, I never ask our clients to just take my word for it or a single view. So I come prepared with real data, real facts, and I'll walk you through these facts right now. The first variable in our equation for explaining what's going on is H, and that H stands for history. So and it's really about our recent history, but let's talk about that for a minute. For decades, agent commission plans were largely unchanged. They sat at 50-50 split. And to be honest with you, frank with you, when I got into the business at 18 years old, the broker paid me 50% of the revenue that was generated on that commission. I was glad to have it. And he did a whole lot of stuff for that. Well, we went decades into this process, 50-50 splits. And then in 1973, RE/MAX was founded. Well, RE/MAX brought a new compensation model, and that compensation model essentially all over the country was if you paid $1,500 a month, if you committed to $18,000 a year to your broker, that is the agent paying the broker, then the agent would be able to keep 100% of the GCI, that was the gross commission income that was generated by their work. RE/MAX model exploded, rightfully so. They provided a new model, and that new model on agent compensation had tremendous growth. Well, what most people forget is that during that period of time, the National Association of Realtors actually had prohibitions in their code of ethics requiring that brokers not compete for or try to recruit another broker's agents. If a broker did that, they could have their license suspended, and if they did it repeatedly, it could and did often result in total revocation of a broker's license. So we have a new model, a disruptive model, growing like crazy in the National Association of Realtors, prohibiting any intra-industry recruiting. That sets the stage for the National Association of Realtors to be sued by the Department of Justice, and they were. In the early 80s, the National Association of Realtors came under attack, and they settled the lawsuit with the Department of Justice, removing that anti-recruiting statute or rules and regulations. What happened after that Department of Justice settlement? I would say we went into a period of flat-out open recruiting, and one of the primary tools that the industry used for recruiting was commission splits. And back then, 50% was then escalated to 52. Pretty soon people were offering 54, 56, and on and on, and we were off to the races with regard to commission plan changes. RE/MAX, by the way, continued to grow, and into the probably 4 or 5 years after that Department of Justice, they hit their peak, and their growth rate slowed, and they began to plateau. What was actually happening in the country is real estate agents that wanted that 100% model switched to it, but those who wanted it and couldn't quite step up to the commitment of $18,000 a year fixed expenses plus operational overhead for their business, advertising, etc. They were stuck where they were. Well, enter Keller Williams. Keller Williams entered the national landscape offering 70-30%. And when that 30% equaled $18,000, the agent could accelerate to 100%. Of course, all of that with a 6% franchise fee or royalty fee tacked on. So what we have is this history of no recruiting. RE/MAX shows up. Now you can recruit each other's agents. RE/MAX plateaus. Keller Williams takes off. And what Keller Williams brilliantly did was they removed the obstacle of the fixed expense. So an agent could get to the 100% at a fairly low risk way, and Keller Williams' growth rate now begins to skyrocket. In the meantime, strong traditional companies, strong regional companies, traditional split companies still remained in the market share lead, but their lead began to shrink. And I would say ever since that time, strong traditional companies have had a challenge holding on to their market share. As these models continue to build momentum, now it brings us to our next variable in the equation, technology. And there are really 3 important concepts that I want to talk to you about with regard to technology. And you know how this goes. Technology is one of those words that and one of those concepts that we could talk for a long time. But there are 3 important things I want you to know on this part of in this variable equation. Number 1 is that we're no longer in the inventive phase of technology as it relates to our business. Certainly worldwide and in a lot of different businesses, invention is still very much a part of the world. But relative to the technologies, web-based technologies that are being brought to our industry, we are not in the inventive phase. We are adapting and deploying mature technology. And that deployment is strong, smart, and it's entrepreneurial in nature. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The second point I want to make is that these are great tools. They're not just good. They're fantastic tools that help agents with workflow management, that help agents with communications and marketing solutions. And importantly, now consumer-facing tools are showing up, not only providing data for consumers, but they're providing knowledge through the portals. The third point I want to make, and by the way, I am fully aware that point of data and knowledge is an important one, and one that we often say in our industry, well, the web can give you lots of data, but it can't give you knowledge. And we're starting to see very different occurrence in that front. So the third point I want to make is that the technology tools, services, and support are now ubiquitous. They're everywhere. It's becoming harder and harder to differentiate on the notion of a technology bundle of services for agents. MLS consolidation equals rampant proliferation of technology for agents. And I think it's going to continue, and here's why. Last year, at this time, there were approximately 700 MLSs. Now we're down to just over 600. I believe that this consolidation is on its way to 150. People I speak to around the country pretty much concur that we really don't need more than 2 or 3 MLSs per state, and that may be still aggressive. But as we shrink from 7 to 6 on our way to 150, MLSs, separate organizations, are competing for their very survival. And how are they doing that? They're driving more and more services in, and a good bit of those services are technology-related tools, and they're driving those or piling more of those tools into their memberships. And an important economic piece of this happens when you consolidate membership from 725 into 150, that membership also consolidates money. It drives more revenue for these MLSs, and with which they can do more tools, services, and support. They do this too, by way of, in many cases, no increased costs. So let me explain. Over the last 25 years, as new bells and whistles, new pieces of functionality were coming on scene, brokerages would make the investments that they needed to make to design, development, and deploy these services. That drove appetite in the marketplace for those same tools and services. And the MLSs went to their providers, and you know who they are, CoreLogic, Black Knight, and the like. They go to their providers and say, bring this to our MLS. Again, MLS competing with their neighboring MLS for dominance, and they're seeing the consolidation. So they want to add more stuff in, and Black Knight and CoreLogic and the like will do these technology services. They'll add them in for low or no cost, in some cases for just a couple of years extension of the contract. So broker value proposition continues to get damaged, as it has for the last 20 years. As MLS consolidates, I think we're going to see more and more of that. You know, we know the definition of a commodity. A commodity is something that is a non-differentiated product or service. A non-differentiated product or service or commodity is sold on one dimension, and that dimension is price. So as MLSs, entrepreneurs, and third parties make mature technology available to our real estate agents, and they're doing so with high-tech, high-impact tech tools and services, technology is everywhere. That leads us to the next variable, and the next variable is E. E stands for expectations. We could spend a week or two on just the changing expectations of consumers and agents for sure, but there's really only 2 points I want to make about this. The first is that agents have now had years and years of expecting different things than their brokers, different entities than their brokers to deliver these tools. They're getting their tools from mortgage companies, title companies, Trulia, Zillow, Realtor.com, MLSs, in some cases, boards. Their expectations of where they're going to get their mission critical services has changed, and it's changed away from reliance on the broker. Likewise, consumers used to expect that they would get their information and their knowledge, as well as actually affect the sale solely through their agent and their brokerage. Now, home valuations, property trend analysis, make me move options, instant offers, it's all available, and the consumers have an ever increasing awareness that they have non-brokerage options, and they have tremendous appetite for this web-based information. It's very consumer centric for someone to be online for 14, it's part of how consumers operate, to be online for 14, 16, 20 months before they buy, all the while educating themselves. So as it relates to expectations, both agents and consumers have changed dramatically. So history plus technology plus expectations leads us to the force multiplier, which you should see on your screen now is Z. And Z stands for Zillow and Zillow-like direct-to-consumer channels. These platforms are taking advantage of our history, they're taking advantage of the state of technology development, and of the changing expectations of consumers. Let me just comment on that for a moment. The changing expectations of consumers. If you've spent much time in New York City, you know what a difficult time you would have hailing a cab. It's competitive. You stand on the curb, you get soaking wet in the process. Well, Uber and Lyft figured out that if they make the transaction more convenient, less complex, less expensive, less problematic, and that they would affect the market. And if you want to study on disruptive technology, I've got some information and some slides that'll show you just how disruptive it can be. So these platforms are taking advantage of all of those things, just like we see with Uber and Lyft in the cab industry. Zillow and the like are not just information portals. They are direct-to-consumer for sale by owner services, and they are investor purchase facilities, they're direct to builder, as we saw last year. They're direct to builder listings and sales portals, they're marketing engines, and they're beginning to replace organized licensed real estate as the trusted advisor, the only place you need to go in most customers' mind. You start that process on entities like Zillow. It's a tremendous impact on our business. Let's see. So how did all that occur? We gave, again, this is one of those moments where I'm going to try to stay focused, but we gave those folks our listing inventory. And actually, we didn't even give it to them. We paid them to take it. And as a result, Zillow now has in 2017, Zillow achieved 330% more buyer traffic than Realtor.com. We've paid for the right to have our own leads back over $1 billion in that same period of time. Can you imagine? We paid them to take the listings, and then they charged us for over $1 billion from real estate agents and brokers to get their leads back. All this adds up to an explosion of it. And by the way, those portals in some cases are working to replace the broker's website, and have replaced a long time ago the broker's website for the most lead traffic in the business. All this adds up to explosion of the transaction fee and transaction fee agent compensation model. There's a huge incentive for this to happen, by the way. Bottom of your slide should say 75 billion. The cumulative value of commission business in this country in 2017 was just under $75 billion. And what that means is there's a big incentive for entities to enter our business, improve the process, and win tremendous financial benefit. Ladies and gentlemen, the wolf is at the door. This is not a cry wolf moment. All right, so let's shift for a moment. I want to add two more things and tell you a little bit of a story of our personal journey, or my personal journey. If the basic algebra that I just went through wasn't enough to convince you about what's been happening in the industry, history plus technology expectations times Zillow isn't enough to convince you, understand that during the last 12 months, over $1.2 billion was added to these models, was brought to bear in the perpetuation, and in some cases the launch of the money was brought by the way, private equity and venture capital into the new models. You've heard them before: Purple Bricks, Compass, United, Homesmart, EXP, Redfin, and they're all receiving big funding. My epiphany moment came as we were considering buying a transaction fee model, and the #1 transaction fee model in the Houston market. I'll tell you in just a minute how we got to that decision. But as we were going through that process, I did a market analysis of the distribution of business. The #1 and #2, and by the way, Houston is the second or third largest metropolitan marketplace in the nation now, with 6.5 million people. And if you look at that market and you look at market share, the #1 and #2 companies are flying traditional flags. The #3 company is the company that we purchased, Realty Associates, and the #4 company is also, and that's a transaction fee model. The #4 company is a transaction fee model. And as you go through 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and you go all the way to 18, the transaction fee or transaction fee like model is dominating the landscape of market share. We could talk about how that happened and why, but that's another process. It's very clear that transaction fee models and the like are, as Victor has said to me, explosive in nature. Okay, the next thing I want to add to is the question I get asked all the time is, does that mean it's going to happen in our market? And that takes evaluation and that takes analysis. But I want to tell you, one of the things that brokerages have tended to feel some sense of safety around is the idea that, well, that happened in Houston, or that happened in in New Orleans, or that's happening in my MLS, and my MLS is a very small MLS, and it doesn't compare to size, so it likely won't happen. But I will tell you that it is happening, and as MLSs consolidate and grow in size, they're going to have the same financial engines to be able to do these things. The price for, or the interest in MLS providers to deliver these services is going to have them adding more and more in. And I think we're going to see this even proliferated than we have in the last 5 years. So the decision that we needed to make was a tough one. Ultimately, we did add a transaction fee to our portfolio, but the process for that decision was pretty interesting. I remember sitting on a Thursday and we were talking to each other about should we or shouldn't we move forward. We had the LOI purchase, we had the letter of intent to purchase ready to go. Of course, it was non-binding, and now we have to pull the trigger and we have to move forward. We said that we'd make the final decision by Monday morning. Sunday night, early in the wee hours, 2 o'clock, I think it was 2 a.m., I was watching deep in the cable channel network, sports greats and what made them so. And it came to an interview with Wayne Gretzky. And Wayne Gretzky, as the interviewer said, is commonly referred to as the best NHL player to ever put on skates. And he's asked the question. In fact, the interviewer says you're commonly referred to as the best to put on skates. Your nickname was the Great One. What made the difference between you and everybody else? And he reiterates that now famous quote that it seemed as though most players learned to skate to chase the puck, and I learned to skate to where the puck was going. And at that moment, I sent an email that said, yeah, we need to go. We need to do this, and we need to enter the transaction fee model. That was a tough decision. We had a lot of concerns about what our traditional company colleagues and friends, remember, a 100-year-old company, we had a lot of people that were fighting this model as we were, and we were worried about relationships and referral business, all kinds of ramifications, but we decided to go. In essence, we skated to where the puck was going, or where we thought it might be going.
And to be clear,
in
Rick,
addition to that,
you were operating a traditional brokerage, and then a few states away, you were operating the transaction fee brokerage, right?
Well, a few states is one way to put it. It's actually the neighboring state, Louisiana and Texas. And Victor, it was by car from our most western office. It was about an hour and a half drive. So yeah, it was out of the technical state, but within an hour and a half of our operations, our 100-year-old operations in Louisiana. There's some things that we need to be able to do.
How did you explain to your agents in one market that were under the traditional model what you were doing in the other market?
Well, the plain fact is that the markets were different enough that we just told them what we did. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about it. It's a Houston marketplace, and Louisiana knows Houston. It's all in the energy corridor, but we didn't jump in and do a lot of overt communication about what we did and why we did it and the difference between the models. We certainly had questions, and we made those announcements too. I think the first announcement we made was in Charleston at our top of the ladder, our top agent trip. We let them know what we were doing, and they asked us questions about why and how is it different, and we answered them in real time. But one of the things that's really important at the same time is that we worked to shore up our traditional business models, and we did those things. And guys, I will tell you that no matter whether you're thinking about moving into an alternative agent compensation model or not, it's really important that these things be done. The things that I'm putting up on the screen now be done with excellence. They are not optional. Whether you're moving into it or not, the market is changing. So we need to aggressively market our value proposition to agents. That is not an easy thing to do. I recommend creating a dashboard of communication methods to make sure that, and set a goal for communication inside the company to make sure, inside your companies, to make sure that all the things you're doing that add value to your agents' relationships are done and talked about, and success stories shared and reiterated. You need to train your managers to be able to articulate the value proposition and do so consistently. And when I say articulate, I don't just mean state it. I mean communicate it in such a way that the agents know the tangible benefit they get from that value from all the things you do. So if you're very philanthropic in a community, then you better be talking to them about how that not only they should feel good about it, but you should be talking to them about how that translates to more business for them. You need to reassess and manage the cost side of the business. And I would say at this point, you need to do that very aggressively. You need to make sure the tools, technology, and support are relevant and utilized. That's not an easy thing to do. And you need to create listening mechanisms to stay in touch with what your agents think and need. And as the market changes and evolves, that's not something that can be taken for granted. I know a lot of companies say, hey, we're a listening company, but then you ask them, so how do you do that? And they kind of look back at us and say, well, we just tell them. Well, we just tell them what we're doing, and we take anecdotal information. But listening mechanisms formalized in an organization can go very far to helping you stay in touch with your agents, especially when you have 3,000 agents and larger companies. So look, I've been through enough major company transformations to know that shoring up the core business is an absolute must, and it's part of any major change initiative in this way. So as we move on, one of the key questions, and Victor asked me to make sure we spend a little time on what have we learned from the implementation. I'd like to just run you through some of those things. And I'll tell you first, to set the stage, I wish I had a full day to walk you through all that I've learned in bringing the transaction fee model and experiencing the transaction fee model into our portfolio. But this is just the high points. First is you have to deal with your detractors. As you start talking to your internal leadership team and the people who influence decisions in your company, there will be a tremendous amount of resistance. There will be people who say, no, we shouldn't do this. And they'll have really good sounding resistances, like it's not who we are. It's not in our geography. It's not our value proposition. You need to manage them and manage them assertively, and you need to move boldly anyway. It just goes without saying that detractors who stand in the face of change can, if you let them, can take you off the rails, and those rails are going to lead you to success. We also have to know what is and isn't a transaction fee model. It is not a discount model, and it's not a 100% model, but those are some of the terms we often use to describe it, and those lead you down a wrong path. It's not by its nature, it is not a discount to consumer model. By nature, it's not a 100% model. But don't reflexively disregard this type of brokerage is another thing that we learned. It's all too easy to say, no, it's not for me. It's not what we do. It's not who we are. And when you do that and you don't seriously consider the ramifications of that position, it can lead you down the wrong path. Another thing that I heard a lot is that agents are very different in those kinds of companies. And the truth is, my experience, they're not demonstrably different in skill, integrity, in passion for the business. They're just not. I play a game with my children when they were young called I Close My Eyes and Listen. And what do I hear? And I teach them to taught them to pay attention to the sounds in their environment. I hear a train whistle very, very near, or whatever that is. But when we first closed and we first bought the company in Houston, I sat in the meetings and I listened to the words that agents said. And I listened to their questions and their concerns. And I listened very closely to, how they, the challenges that they were having in developing their business. And it didn't sound any different than the challenges that we were experiencing in Louisiana at the time. And so that was a real aha moment. Agents are not demonstrably different in skill or integrity. This is a demographic-driven migration to, we talk about the average age of an agent in the business. This is their business, and therefore our business is portable. You know very well when you lose an agent and you lose their book of business, it's portable, it's business that goes with them. They don't just take their revenue, they take ours too. These can be very profitable brokerages is another learning experience. It's hard on the surface if you're managing a company where you're struggling to hang on to company dollar retained percentages. It's hard to understand this, but there is a lot of profit to be made in for the brokerage operator in transaction fee. They require these transaction fee models require a very significant technology platform, and I will say it needs to be built the right way. When you're talking about technology, the cost to iterate, reiterate, and deploy tools, web-based tools, over and over. And when I say deploy, I mean design, develop, get it out, and get it adopted into the brokerage that you're running, and get good absorption rates or adoption rates. The cost to do that is exorbitant. By the time you get it done to any level, 30, 40%, 50% adoption, there's a new and better version of that. And now you're trying to get adoption of a tool that's pretty much out of date. Okay, so look, the next thing you'll see on the slide is a three-step process. Before we get to that, I want to tell you that if you're leading an organization and you're trying to drive change to a different model, one that resonates more with agents today, you're going to have people, as I said, resist you. They'll make a fuss. They'll make outlandish claims. But then when you're 36 months down the road, and you're experiencing the profit, and that profit is a high percentage of your overall business, vindication is yours. You still have to move boldly. We take our clients through a three-step process. So how do we deal with all of this stuff? First step is that we encourage them to know thyself. That's 3 steps: know thyself, set the future, and execute well the transition. With regard to know thyself, it's important that you know your market, know your metrics, know your goals, and know your organization's capability and capacity for change. When you talk about know your market, we're talking about competition, trends, the end consumer demographics. As we move into know your metrics, we're talking about things like gross commission income and company dollar retained numbers year over year, and what's the trend. We're talking about volume and units market share. I'll just give you something. Many of the clients we talk to say, hey, everything seems to be going well. Our sales volume is up. But over the last 3 years, when we remove the net effect of average price increases, especially in those markets where price increases are a direct result of a shortage of supply of inventory, we remove that effect and find out that, whoops, they're underperforming the marketplace. We talk about metrics being recruiting and attrition numbers. How are you doing over time? Are you growing organically or are you not? And not just people, but actual production of the people you're recruiting. And then things like cost of living trend increases and net profit. Regarding your goals, it's important to know that you have to start to think about succession plans. Do you personally, as the brokerage operator or owner, have the energy for change? What are your personal financial goals? What is your tolerance for risk? And then lastly, knowing your organization's capability and capacity. What is your leadership's current competency for change? How will it affect your culture? How will it affect your brand capacity, or your brand value, rather? The next step after know thyself is set your future. There's really 3 general directions for set your future. This is the black box. This is the tough stuff where you work to determine the right strategy for you. And it's the art science I love most about working with our clients. It's important to move boldly towards the strategies that are right for you. And there is no one solution. There is no one single answer. So as we talk about setting your future, there are 3 general directions. One is to retain your traditional model. And you can go down that route and keep the status quo. You can become more of who you already are and create greater differentiation between you and in a transaction fee model brokerage. You can scale up, you can add lines of business, you can add revenue to the company, or you can niche market up, property type, geography, niche up, or you can cut parts of your business out and not do them anymore. And then you can just do pure play downsize, decide to live with a smaller brokerage. You can exit the business. And I know there's a lot of people who are of the age where they're looking at their career finish line. It's time for them to stop and smell the roses. It's time for you to stop and smell the roses. You can sell. You can work with next generation succession, or you can apply the expertise that you've learned in the current business to an entirely new business. And we've helped people do that. The third major direction set, it will be, of course, to adopt a transaction fee model in whole or in part. And then you have decisions like build or buy. And you have decisions like to adopt a new brand to deploy this, as some people have tried to do, or even like we did, a slightly different geography. So now that you've set your future, now comes the execute well. There's many considerations during the planning process. The old-fashioned strategy planning was all about picking a point on the horizon and moving towards it. And while that worked for a long time, the pace of change just doesn't allow that anymore. I tell our clients that it's far more, this process, the process that you see on the screen leads you to a process of learning to innovate and innovate quickly, not just setting a strategy and 3 to 5 years later, seeing if it's the right strategy. This work is very different for each person we work with, but here are some common questions that we cover before doing a deep dive in the planning implementation. One, am I truly vulnerable? How do I do this and avoid cannibalizing my existing business? How do I build management talent and bandwidth inside my organization? What's the right timing for us? Am I seeing clearly, or am I stuck in my current paradigm? And that point is huge. We see that so often. How can I quickly reduce my overhead? And is it the right model for the next generation to run? How do we help you? You know, this is an interesting process for us. There's a lot of ways I could talk to you about how we engage with our clients, but here's what I really want you to take away from today. The time for change is here. As a matter of fact, it's probably a little late, but it's here at least. We can't go back. The time for change is now. The process of change requires a really honest look at yourself and a willingness to move boldly into the future, whichever future you select. And the third is, if adopting a transaction fee model happens for you, if it's in your future, it will not be the last major change that you'll go through. And therefore, building an innovation capability for the future for your organization is key. What you see on the screen now, it talks to you, is there to tell you some of the ways that we can engage in the future to help you. We can do everything from a rapid strategy reset to a long-run implementation process that includes mergers and acquisitions work and help you scale and help you move through implementation. Listen, it was such a privilege to talk to you today. I'm going to wrap up and take some questions. But I look forward to hearing your questions, and I'm always available to deepen the conversation for you and your company. You'll see an email address at the end. Feel free to email me or call me, whichever works best for you. And Victor, I'm going to turn it back to you so we can start to handle some questions.
Thank you very much, Rick. You did a great job. I really appreciate you sharing all your insights. Clearly, you've
a lot to cover.
Spent a lot of time. It is, and I think, based upon our perspective, one of the things that I really like about the process is that you guys were highly focused on really taking a professional look toward how you make these decisions, and doing a lot of research and really understanding what the outcomes were going to be along the way. So we do have a couple questions that came in. Just so you know, if you open the questions dialog box in the GoToWebinar control panel, you can enter your question and we'll get it answered for you. So the first question that came in is, can you help us defend our traditional brokerage model? So there's a lot of brokerages today that are facing tremendous recruiting pressure from these transaction fee brokers. How do you work with a firm to help them reposition themselves and articulate their value proposition to defend what they're doing today?
Yeah, Victor, that is a great question. And I quickly checked through a slide, but some of the key components that need to be done had to do with assessing your current value proposition. If you want to defend a traditional commission split with agents, a traditional compensation plan wherein the broker is keeping a much higher percentage of the gross commission income, then you need to make sure that you identify, and that starts with your leadership team. So we run deep dives into what are the most valued items, assets that a broker brings to the table. And that's not as easy as you might think, but you do a deep dive into what are the components of the value proposition. Then you work towards training, and that's practice, drill, and rehearse type stuff. There's nothing sexy about it, but you need to be able to tell the story of value. And that's not the story of ancient history. That's the story of all that you're doing today that's leading an agent to be more successful, to leading an agent to have more opportunities for higher earnings and peace of mind about their financial future. You need to reassess your leadership team's ability to do that. And you know, there was a slide that I put up in our managers meetings for the first 3 or 4 years that said our value proposition is only as good as our leadership's ability to first make them aware and then get our agents to use those tools and services to the point where they receive the benefits. The last thing I would say about that is you absolutely need to create listening mechanisms to see what the agents are thinking about all that you're doing. Now, keep in mind, if you're not communicating the value, if you're not holding up stories that example the value, then the perception of those tools and services will be low. And you have to be able to understand how to sort through the perception problem from the reality. So maybe the prescription is a much more robust communication effort, training and practicing those skills and those tools into the organization. But perhaps it's that you don't have the right tools, and the listening mechanisms inside the company will be able to help you determine where the problem, if it's a perception problem or a reality problem. Make sense?
Yeah, 3-pronged strategy. Train your managers to communicate the value. Well, you have to develop your value. Train the managers to communicate it. Continually communicate to the agent, and then develop listening mechanisms for feedback so you stay on track.
You got it.
Would you consider operating both a traditional transaction fee model, or a traditional and a transaction fee model in the same market?
Yes, I would. Now, we happen to do it, and I shared with you some of the hand-wringing that we did leading into that discussion, or I did leading into that discussion. But yes, I would definitely consider it. And now take the last question first. In the same market, it is all the more important that in the onboarding and recruiting of new agents that they understand which model best suits them, and they understand how that needs to function. So here's a good example. Let's say a brand new agent enters the business, and they don't have a book of business. They've not been in this type of business before. They need a tremendous service and support from the brokerage itself. Well, they're probably not a good candidate for a go do it yourself kind of response, like transaction fee. You're not going to get the tools and services you need from the broker. So start your business, learn everything, and oh, by the way, go find it. Also, that has to be checked against what are the options available to that agent in the marketplace. In the examples that I've used in the past, there are MLSs that deliver a lot of sameness and technology tools compared to the broker. So, anybody on this call that's ever had a top agent walk into them and say, I'm going to make a business decision to leave you. I'm going to go to a company that'll pay me more. A transaction fee model, maybe. And you say, well, what about this? And what about that? And they say, well, I really haven't used those things in the last year or two. You haven't hit the mark with that agent. So when you assess the availability of tools and services and support inside your marketplace, outside of your brokerage and that particular agent, you can give them good advice about which model to join. And yes, I would do that. There are strategies geographically, there are strategies branding wise, and both of those need to come into the process of decision making.
You know, I can tell you, we do a lot of agent satisfaction study research for our brokerage clients, and you know, it's pretty telling when you see adoption numbers low on products and services that you're buying for the agents. I mean, you got to fix that right away. It's almost a forecast of breakage that's coming. So the next question that we have here is related to, do you see anything happening in regards to transaction fee models with a tech fee on top? Do you think that's sort of leading the way, or do you just see it as 100% tech fee?
No, I think it's
I stated that wrong.
Hybrid.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. You got it.
Yeah, no, it's you know, Victor, it has to be a win-win for the brokerage and for the agent, and it depends on the competitive environment that you're in. The transaction fee, how much can it be? What's the average selling price? I said that before, that these are not 100% models. They like to be called 100% models, but they're not, because essentially the agent gets 100% of what most people consider. The agent gets 100% of their business costs, and they get a transaction fee. So if you do the math on all that, it's like when Remax approached me in Northern Ohio and they wanted me to buy the franchise. It was a very smart presentation, and they did the math, and they said $1,500 a month. If you get 50 agents, here's what your profit will be at the end of the year. You know, the problem with that strategy is, and by the way, I'm sorry, not the problem, but the agent comes in and they say, well, I have a 100% concept, but they're paying $1,500 a month, $18,000 a year. So is it really a 100% concept? And then if the agent at that time, and this goes back many years, but if at that time the agent's making $30,000 or $40,000, subtract the $18,000 plus all the business expenses, Remax demonstrated to me in the presentation for me to buy the franchise in Northern Ohio that the average agent was making about 61%, but they were walking through our market saying they're getting 100% commission. So yeah, so I don't know if that completely answers the question, but I would say that the fees and structures are just a process of working through the economics and holding up those economics against the marketplace and your competition. Okay.
So one of the points that you made is that, one of the points that you made,
no, you go ahead.
To address another question is that you mentioned that the transaction fee model is not necessarily a 100% model, 100% commission model. Can you unpack that a little bit? Because I think everybody thinks that if you're charging the transaction fee, you don't, then the commission is all to the agent. So explain the difference. What was the point you were making?
Oh, okay. So that's kind of where I was just in the last few minutes. I was trying to explain that 100% model is a marketing nomenclature. If I say to an agent, get 100%, great, you get 100% of the commission. But you subtract the transaction fee, you subtract the additional cost of doing business, and at the end of the day, you look at your GCI and your net income, and you'll find out that there is no such thing as a 100% fee. Yes, they get 100% of the commission, but there are expenses associated with it. Now, don't get me wrong; they're very high payouts to agents, but the broker has a correspondingly low expense structure. So that's what I meant by not 100%. On the agent side of the business, it's not 100%.
So when brokerages are operating this model and they're doing a transaction fee, what kind of price range do you see? Is it like $450, $650 per transaction, $1,000, $250? Where are the numbers laying out?
Victor, it's all over the map based on the market. I think the average selling price in the nation is right around $200,000, $205,000. In Houston, it was just about $209,000, $208,000 somewhere. So it's right in the sweet spot, right in the middle transaction, and one of the middle of the road price transactions. And one of the things that I brought up in terms of the strategy development is that a broker can niche this process. So, for instance, my guess and my experience in dealing, I lived in Connecticut for 10 years. We sold more $1 million plus homes than any company in the state, and that was 25 years ago. I sometimes think, go back to the very first slide in the presentation. This is not a discussion of the agent services that can convince even a very high-end seller that they can deliver what it takes to sell the property, sell it quickly, and eliminate problems, and to represent that property in the global market. You start talking about multi-million-dollar properties, you have to have the right tools in place. Traditionally, agents get those tools from their brokers, but if they can aggregate the necessary marketing and support them, you don't need those tools. United Country is an incredible company that if you haven't checked into, they'll sell $20 million farms and ranches, and it's a real high level concierge. But they also run a transaction fee model, and when somebody in the transaction fee model needs the specialized marketing and support of niche properties or antique and vintage, luxury properties, equestrian properties, they lean over and get those tools from the other side of their operation. So it all depends on whether that agent has the resources, not the price range, but it depends on whether the agent has the resources to be able to adequately market that property on the listing side.
So the last question I have here is related to your experience with M&A. Obviously, you've done a lot of transactions where you've been involved in purchasing traditional companies, and you're one of the unique guys that has actually purchased a transaction fee company. Can you talk about the differences in how, like what the economics are in acquiring those companies? Like, what's the multiple of bottom line, or what's the multiple of EBITDA, or how are you pricing the acquisition of those things? And I think this question is really going to help people who have a transaction fee model understand the value of their company, but it also is going to help people who are looking to acquire a transaction fee model to understand, what kind of calculus they would do in valuing the business. Okay,
so if you ask anybody who's bought companies in the last 10 years, you'll hear a range for anywhere from 3 to 6% multiple, and it depends on the organization's stability in the marketplace, the stability of the revenue stream, sometimes the length of time and the brand in the company. There's a lot of things that you want to attach to the normalization of a P&L. So the process that I used was very simple. Let me say it a different way. The process that I used was very clear cut. We entered into a non-disclosure agreement. We looked at the last 3 years P&Ls, and we know these are small businesses for the most part, so the P&L has to be adjusted for how it will function after the sale. Once you get to that normalized profit and loss, and you can look at what the profit and loss picture is after the sale closes, then you can determine the transaction or the transaction points and the value. So take from 3 to 6% as a multiple of earnings. And after the normalization process takes place, and then you can deal with the actual transaction structure. Like, do you want to leave the current owner in place? Will you have to bring on the employees of that company? Who's going to lead it? Is it a fold-in or is it a geographic extension? When you acquire a company inside your current geographic footprint, for example, the costs associated with running that business are a lot lower than when you extend outside the footprint. So think about a multiple from 3 to 6, depending on the overall strength of the company, of the normalized profit and loss statement, and that's what worked. It's absolutely amazing how
you're valuing it the same way as a traditional brokerage, right? A multiple of profit.
I am, and I'll tell you something else. Please don't everybody take this as gospel, but I want to tell you something else about the stability of the companies. When you have a critical mass of agents, and each one of those, and Dave Cox at Compensation Master is extremely familiar with this point. He is the person that 15 years ago helped me first understand it. When the economic value of the agent is really known, and the economic value of an agent to your company, besides the intangible market share, I'm talking about real economic value, is generated out of a transaction fee, and you get a critical mass of agents, it takes an awful lot to upend that market, to upend that company's P&L. if you have a transaction fee model, let's say has 500 agents, and you lose 100 of them, they decide to leave the business for whatever reason, or move, or retire. You haven't necessarily lost 25% of the revenue of the company, or 20% of the revenue of the company. So yeah, so it's a very stable market once you get the critical mass of agents in the company.
Excellent. Well, Rick, we're out of questions. Thank you very much. We're right at the top of the hour, so we'll let people get on to their next meetings. And I appreciate everyone coming today. We're going to wrap up the webinar. As I mentioned, we'll reach out to you. And if you have any questions for Rick, by all means, reach out to him. You guys have my contact information as well. So thank you very much to everyone for enjoying today's call. And Rick, great job. I really appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. Appreciate all that you do for our industry.
You bet. Have a good afternoon, everyone.